Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Good morning, my name is Dr. Priya Nayak. I teach political science in Zakir Hussain College, University of Delhi, and I'm going to be teaching you international relations. IR, as it is often called, is a widely studied subject. It is a widely practiced subject. It is a hotly followed area when it comes to global politics, international diplomacy, and several universities offer courses on it, making it one of the most popular courses. In this course, I'm not only going to be introducing you to the academic discipline, but I'm also going to be sharing a few traditional theories, upcoming theories, theories which have challenged traditional ways of looking at IR, and briefly just questioning what is the international. Having said that, we're going to plunge right in and examine the question and question the word international itself. What do we mean by the international? And in order to do that, I'm going to invite you to look into your grocery store and see what's available there. Very often when you walk into our kirana ki dukaan or the grocery store, we seldom wonder about the choice of the range of things available to be bought, and it is through an agreement signed in 1995, under which an organization was created called the World Trade Organization, whereby several consumer goods services are facilitated on a global level, is why we have those things in our neighborhood grocery store. So when we look at the term international, we often think that it is something out there, something beyond the national boundary, beyond something which is inaccessible. But the term international has come to mean something extremely local, and in recent years scholars have collapsed those boundaries between the international, the global and the local, and we will be looking into the theorization of the international as much as breaking those boundaries down. So just a little bit about IR as a formal discipline itself. Now, ironically and incidentally, it is exactly 100 years ago that in 1919, in Aptowitz, which is now in Wales, was when IR was formally introduced as an academic discipline. Now, that is very interesting because the formalization of IR meant that for the first time it was going to be studied as a discipline, but of course we have every society, every culture has constantly been thinking about the outside, what is on the outside. But in 1919, getting back to the story, the first school of international relations is opened, and to provide a little interesting story to that, it was started under the encouragement of the American president Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson, as a president, worked tremendously towards championing his liberal cause in IR. He was a formative figure during the First World War, and the timing of the formation of this school says a lot. 1919 is the year when the First World War comes to an end. It is a decade of heralding peace. Till the Second World War, the First World War was called the Great War because it was the most barbaric war ever fought. It involved European nations, and perhaps that is why it was called the Great War. Of course, there were other horrific wars fought as well, but this was the first war which involved European nations. So the timing of IR says a lot about what it expected from this academic discipline. And that is the reason why right from the start, IR had an extremely idealistic expectation. And what I mean by that is that right from the beginning, IR was imagined to be a panacea, it was imagined to bring peace, it was imagined to be a way in which the Second World War could be prevented. And it is in the early 1920s that in the London School of Economics that similarly an IR department is set up. So what one sees is that two things were taking place simultaneously. The first is that the conceptualization of the world out there always existed, but it is only in the early 20th century that in 1919 it was formally begun as an academic discipline. It started off on a very normative note, by which I mean that it had a certain idealistic expectation. So you had Leonard Woolf, the husband of the acclaimed feminist writer Virginia Woolf, who was a dedicated pacifist, working for it. And there was a certain idealistic undertone to studying IR. So IR was a way of achieving peace. That was 100 years ago, and in these 100 years, IR has changed dramatically. It has, the way it is imagined, the way it is conceptualized, the way it is studied has changed dramatically. The people who study it have changed dramatically. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is very recently, a book was published by Christine Sylvester, who is a feminist IR scholar. Probably 100 years ago, the name would have made no sense to mean a feminist IR scholar would have meant nothing. But Christine Sylvester wrote a book recently which talks about IR where you least expect it, and she looks at museums. And it is an exciting work because it looks at museums as a site of IR, and she looks at the making of the British Museum as a way in which during the heyday of British imperialism, exotic objects as far-flung as Greece, as Africa and Latin America were collected and put together under a towering roof. And by that she means that the international exists in this very room. It exists in every site, it exists at every level, and therefore the international is not simply the Great War, it is not about the First World War, the Second World War, but also operates at an everyday level, because all of us are linked together in invisible ways, and IR teaches you to identify those ways. So just to summarize where we've gotten so far, IR formally began in the West 100 years ago, but of course people have constantly been thinking about what lies beyond the national boundary, and its formalization also made it a slightly orthodox discipline. By orthodox, what one means is that right from the start, it was certainly a male-centric vision of the world, and in these last 100 years, several other voices have stepped up, and we'll be looking at this through this during this course. You first had the idealists who expected there to be world peace and work towards it. We also call them the pacifists. Then you had the realists who accepted war, and we have great scholars like Morgenthau and Kenneth Waltz, and you could even put in the Indian mythological god Krishna in this, because he also, in many ways, in the great dialogue in the Mahabharata, which most students would know about, talks about the inescapability of war. So the realists briefly accept war as a state of the structure, but the most exciting bit in IR has taken place in the last 30 years, where IR has been broken into, has been invaded by multiple voices. So within IR theory, one can broadly distinguish between orthodox theories, traditional theories. I mentioned two of them, idealism and realism, and you then also have the critical theories, which are called the reflectivist theories, which question these. I'm just going to name a few because we will be looking at them in the subsequent lectures. The first one, of course, to critique this way would be the Marxist theory, which came up in the 1960s. In the 1970s and 80s, you had critical theory. Richard Davidic is a prime example of that scholarship. And in the last 20 years, you also had invasions by feminist scholars, by Cynthia Enloe, by Anne Ticknor, and the person I just mentioned, Christine Sylvester. So there have been multiple ways of looking at IR, but again we return to the fundamental question, what is IR? If one was to define it, what is IR? Who are the main players? What can we expect when we look at, when we study IR? So what I'm going to do now is going to just discuss a few elements. What are the actors? When we watch a play, we expect to know the dramatis personae. So I'm going to tell you about the dramatis personae of international relations, so that when one starts studying, one knows what we are going to expect. The first element of the international is the state. The state as we know it today, the modern state, is considered to be one of the key actors in international relations. So I'm going to be listing out 5 key actors within IR, and we will be looking at the various dimensions of each of those actors. Now the state is the first key actor because the state fundamentally is the actor on the international stage, and again we see that the term stage comes up pretty often when we study IR, which also indicates that IR is something out there. It is not something which is taking place locally or within the nation, it is something out there. So the first element is the state. Now what is the state and how do we identify it? Theorists of the state would tell you that the modern state as we know it, arose out of the Treaty of Westphalia, that's 1648. That is the Western conceptualization and the valorization of the modern Westphalian state. But what was the Westphalian state? Westphalia is a tiny space in Germany. Between 1618 and 1648, a 30-year war was fought, and this war ended with the Treaty of Westphalia. And the Treaty of Westphalia is celebrated because for the first time there was a divorce of the state from the religion, and there was a concretization of the territorialization of the state, which meant that for the first time there was a recognition that you need to have discernible boundaries within a state to formally call it a territory. And Daniel Philpott, for those who are interested, has written a remarkable history of this period from a very critical point of view, where he looks at the Treaty of Westphalia as the coming of the modern state. And interestingly, in political science, within political theory, there are several theorists around this period who are also conceptualizing the state. Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the famous social contractualists, are also dwelling upon the meaning of the state. What is the relationship between the state and its citizens, the authority of the state, and in many ways the 16th and 17th century is a rich period in Europe to be looking at the state from a theoretical point of view. Within IR, the state is upheld as to be the actor. So the actor is in capitals, and I say that because states are that body which negotiate with each other, and from there we come to the second 2 elements attached to the state. The first is international law and the second is foreign policy. So within IR, there is international law which is codified behavior between states, and again we turn to Europe. Now one will notice that one is constantly looking at Europe, and this of course came to be questioned much later. So the idea that IR is completely Western in nature, in outlook, theoretically is absolutely right, and in many ways its theoreticians and practitioners originally belonged and focused on the West as the site of IR, and of course that has come to be questioned in recent years, and therefore you also have something called the non-Western theory. Again, we will be looking at that a little later. But for now, what we need to focus is on the broader spectrum of what is IR. So the first is that there are states. The second is that these states have a certain code. There is a certain protocol when it comes to behaving with each other. We know about the international law theorist Grotius, who spoke about the law of the nations. So very frequently we talk about the Indian Penal Code, about the code of conduct within a nation, and you have a law governing that. When it comes to the international, there have been ideas that there must be some restraining order, some protocol, some way of handling diplomatic matters at the international level, and that is what we call international law. So a very loose definition of international law would be that codified practice, norms, behavior between states which regulates their behavior. in a in several matters, whether it comes to diplomatic baggage, whether it comes to code of conduct on the battlefield. So you have the Geneva codes for warfare, the code of conduct for how to treat combatants, non-combatants. So there has been an evolution of civil behavior on the international front, and that is what we call international law. So when a diplomat demands that his luggage not be examined, he is carrying the immunity of what has been granted to him by international law. So within international law, states are the primary actors, and of course again this has been traditionally Western, and then the colonized states have been made a part of it. So that's the first element. The second is of course foreign policy. So states, international law, foreign policy, where international law is that widely followed norms, behavior, practices. Foreign policy is that conduct of a state towards another state, again on the outside. So what one means is that foreign policy is attitudes and policies of a state towards another. But just as a small caveat, just to indicate how rich IR is, there are several non-state actors who also have an understanding of the outside. For a key example would be the Indian National Congress. Formed in 1885, this was first a political pressure group, which then became a political party. But the Indian National Congress, the party as we know it in its original avatar, had a certain outlook when it came to the foreign. So foreign policy is not just attitudes, but it also means the ability to execute that policy, and therefore we return to the state. The state is the fundamental actor, and it assumes that there is a clearly defined territory, there is a population, there is a head of government, and these are elements of a state which you probably are familiar with already. If you aren't, then having a look at Hobbes' Law, Crusoe, or any fundamental text on the state would be a useful guide to look at. Right, so we've looked at the state, international law and foreign policy as traditional actors, traditional forums on which IR have played out. But just to fast forward and jolt things up and look at the contemporary situation, there is a body, we could call it a body, a terrorist organization called the Islamic State, which has seized territory in the Middle East, declared war, and created havoc as a terrorist organization. Since the conceptualization of IR, there's also been an increasing need to consider actors which are not the state, but nonetheless play a great role in IR as independent actors. So the first would be to categorize all of these would be non-state actors, actors which have a role to play in IR, but they are not the state. And the first one would be, there are quite a few, but let's start off with religion. And I speak about religion because religion was clearly the earliest contestant competitor to the modern state. And why does one say that? Why does one say that? One says that because the Holy Roman Church with the Pope at its head was for several centuries an intensely political position. The Pope had the authority to excommunicate kings. The Pope had the authority to sanction the reign of a king. And the Pope had traditionally immense authority over kings and queens in Europe. And of course, all of that changed with Henry VIII. So when Henry VIII divorced his wife, Catherine of Aragon of Spain, it was the first time that a king had initiated the divorce of his wife. And of course, that meant that the Roman Catholic Church was not going to accept that. And it led to the separation of the Church of England from the Church of Rome. So when one looks back, one sees that there have always been contestants, there's always been competition to political power. And religion, not just in terms of Islamic terrorism, which everybody is so quick to point out, religion has always played a role within the state, and the Holy Roman Church is a classic example of how the modern state in Europe has literally grown by wresting power from the Holy Roman Pope. And for those who are interested, they could look up Henry VIII and look at the classic confrontation between a king and the Pope. And therefore, when one looks at the international, several non-state elements have also played a crucial role in shaping international events, shaping international diplomacy. Christianity has and the Crusades, for instance, were clearly a struggle for global ascendancy, and we can see that traditionally religion has indeed played a role in shaping states, shaping states' policies, shaping of foreign policy decisions. And the example of Henry VIII was specifically mentioned because it also changed the way in which Great Britain adopted Protestantism, and that in turn changed the course of history in multiple ways. We do know that the Catholics who were persecuted within Great Britain then left for America, and which is where the 13 new colonies were founded in the United States. So religion has been a huge catalyst, has been a huge propeller of international history. And it is now that scholars are coming to look at religion as a force in international relations, not just through the categorization of Islamic terrorism. So Christianity and Judaism, the creation of Israel, for instance, in 1948, was clearly a decision guided by religious passion, fervor, intent, and in no way just to deflect the attention from Islamic terrorism. Other religions have equally shaped borders, territories, and decisions. If Christianity has had indeed played a role, so has Islam. We do know that the classic example of non-state actors are terrorist organizations. Quite a few of them are Islamic terrorist organizations, and of course the classic event-changing attack of September 9/11 was example of how non-state actors are challenging the state in the one distinction that has always been maintained between states and non-state actors. So a classic definition of the state would mean a clearly defined territory, population, a government, plus a monopoly over armed forces, which is legitimate. So in Max Weber's definition, a state has a monopoly over violence, which is legitimate, which means that the state has an army, it wages wars, but all of that is done with a nationalist fervor, and it is just accepted, and there is a certain legitimacy to it. What one sees with terrorist organizations are that terrorist organizations also are challenging the legitimacy over violence by the widespread support that they enjoy. So for instance, the IS has been a tremendous threat for the sheer attraction it has held to recent converts, people committed to the particular form of Islam whereby they feel that a certain Islamic state has to be established. And religion certainly has played a huge role in shaping IR and its outcomes. Now the third example of a non-state actor is our international organizations, and of course terrorist organizations are also international organizations, but unlike terrorist organizations, international organizations, the member states are usually states. But before we finish with terrorist organizations, just a little bit about terrorism and the history of terrorism, which ironically and incidentally began first in Russia as a form of militant attack against the state. And it is from Russia and against the absolutist power of the Tsar that terrorism as a legitimate way of people resisting the state spread across the world. So we now come to a major area of international organizations. Within international law, states enjoy a legal personality, by which is meant that states are the primary, are considered people when it comes to the international platform, and international organizations have come close to mimicking states in multiple ways. What is an international organization? An international organization is an organization which has states as members. It has an international aim which can only be achieved by the international cooperation of those member states. So it is not surprising that the earliest international organization set up was to do with the International Postal Union, which was at the end of the 19th century. And from that point on, there have been multiple sites of action, several common intentions whereby member states have gotten together to achieve a certain end. A classic example of that is the Red Cross. Now, the Red Cross was set up by Henry Durand at the end of the Crimean War, when he saw bloodshed and the plight of combatants on the battlefield. And the Red Cross is clearly an early example of a commitment to ethical ideal, whereby combatants and the wounded would deserve a certain humane treatment. So the Red Cross, the International Postal Union are one of the early cooperative initiatives at the international level. But at the early 20th century is when we see that international organizations truly kick off. The early 20th century is an exciting period in every which way for a scholar of IR, because this is a time when people's conceptualizations of the international are changing. The First World War starts in 1914, ends in 1918, and during the war, America's role changes dramatically. America steps in 1917 when Woodrow Wilson is the president, and by the end of the war, Woodrow Wilson is a key member, is a key player in international politics, and we know that for a long period, America stayed away from being involved in European politics on the grounds of neutrality, and it's abstained from participating in global politics. So in many ways, the early 20th century is a coming of age of IR in many ways, primarily because America begins participating in global politics in a more wholehearted way. And Woodrow Wilson is quite the key player at this point of time because of his vision of liberalism. And what one means by liberalism is the belief that citizens have a right to challenge the state's absolute power, and there's a certain balance between the citizen and the state. And Woodrow Wilson championed those rights to such a degree that at the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, at the end of the First World War, he championed the cause of the creation of these three states, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. You all could look it up on the map after class and see as to how the right to self-determination, the right of a people to shape their future, became such a key slogan, principle, on account of Woodrow Wilson's commitment to the liberal ideal. So what I mean by the liberal ideal is the idea that the citizen and the state, there's a balance between them. The state cannot crush the individual. And Woodrow Wilson, as the President of America, championed those ideals. He was a key figure at the Treaty of Versailles. And it is at the Treaty of Versailles that there exists the germ and the idea that an international organization can be set up to prevent such a war from taking place again. Just to remind you all, till the Second World War, the First World was called the Great War because it was horrific, its scale was terrible, and I think there was a sense of disbelief amongst Europeans about how such civilized people could go to war. Of course, they've had a bloody history of colonization, they've been merciless and barbarous, but not on European territory. So in many ways, the First World War changed that idea of the cultivated, sophisticated white mind and demonstrated the brutality within. And it is during this time that the first attempt is made at shaping an international organization, and that organization is called the League of Nations. The League of Nations was the first truly international organization committed to world peace and conceptualized at the Treaty of Versailles. It was an organization dedicated to make sure that a second world war does not take place by a simple but powerful idea, simple, powerful, but perhaps unrealistic idea of collective security, which we will again be seeing in a subsequent class. But the irony of the story is that when Woodrow Wilson returns from France to America, the American Congress refuses to accede to the League of Nations, and as a consequence, America is not a member of the League of Nations, giving it its first blow. But from 1919 onwards, League of Nations is the first attempt to cultivate a sense of a global community to make sure that a second world war does not take place. Of course, it did. By the 1930s, with the militarization of Germany, the militarization of Japan, the militarization of Italy, one sees that there were, the writing was on the wall that there was a march towards war, and the League of Nations was quite incapable, and that policy has been attributed to appeasement. But our focus here is on international organizations. The League died a death at the start of the Second World War. It had died many deaths before this when key nations pulled out and refused to commit to the League of Nations vision. But the League of Nations was the forefather of what was to come after the Second World War, and that is the United Nations. Today, the United Nations is an umbrella organization, by which I mean it is not only the United Nations itself, but there are several bodies within it committed to a widespread social, economic, humanitarian, political causes, from human rights to disability to the environment to women's rights. So the United Nations is not just a body, it is an umbrella body with several bodies within it. But the point that we are trying to underline here is that that organizations are not states, but nonetheless have come to exercise a power comparable to the state. The United Nations is one such example of that. And from 1945 onwards, incidentally, India was a founding member of the United Nations. It is incidental because India was not a free independent state at the time, but nonetheless it was granted the privilege of being a founding member. So India has been a founding member despite the fact that it was a colony in 1945. And from that point of time, the United Nations has spread out in multiple ways, from peacekeeping to peace security to preventing armed conflict, ethnic cleansing, and it is truly a mammoth body in every way. So the United Nations is just one example of international organizations occupying a pervasive space, almost an invasive space. And by an invasive space, what I mean is that traditionally IR was thought to be a spectrum where the state created a foreign policy, the foreign policy was applied as international, and the hierarchy functioned with the state at the head. The last century, however, has demonstrated that that hierarchy does not exist. The opposite spectrum also exists, which means that the international can also play a huge role at people who you would think have impunity from being put on trial. So what I'm referring to are those organizations which have constantly questioned the monopoly of the state, which have constantly questioned the authority of the state in multiple ways. We will be looking at three of those ways. We'll end with climate change, which of course is such a which is a pressing question of the moment. But the first area that I want to look at is, of course, the absolute power of the head of a state, which itself has come to be questioned by international organizations. So there's a United Nations, there is the International Labour Organization, there is the Red Cross, there is Oxfam, there is Greenpeace. There are multiple international organizations which work for different causes, be it the environment or social or other areas. But the one area that I want to dwell upon is the unthinkable possibility of an international organization putting on trial a head of a state. Now, it's unthinkable because national leaders, heads of states, exercise a certain impunity, and under that belief carry out horrific acts of violence. So the two incidents, the two major events that I am referring to are the International Tribunal of Crime, which was set up after the Rome Statute in 1997. So in many ways, the end of the 20th century demonstrated that which was almost impossible 100 years ago, which was the right of the international community to prosecute the head of a state. So in multiple arenas, international organizations have been pressing down on improving human life, improving accountability of the state, improving the citizens' right over the state. And the classic example of that is the International Crime Tribunal, which was opened as a Rome Statute in 1998, under which genocide, crimes against humanity was seen as the right of the International Crime Tribunal to prosecute the head of a state and other indicted individuals. Now, in many ways, this is extraordinary. The state is considered sovereign, which means that within a state, the head of the state cannot be questioned. But in many ways, the 1998 Rome Statute achieved precisely the opposite. It allowed heads of state to feel the pressure, feel the heat, feel the accountability and the loss of the impunity in the face of horrific acts of war, horrific acts of genocide, crimes against humanity. 100 years ago, Wilhelm II of Germany was sent to exile after the First World War on accounts of his crimes. 100 years later, in 2002, when the International Crime Tribunal on Yugoslavia was set up, Milosevic was prosecuted and convicted as guilty of the mentioned crimes. Now, this was a radical revolutionary step. It exists precisely because there is a sense that we are connected as a global community, that irate and unpredictable, vicious leader should not be the reason why a citizen of a state should have a life different from the citizen of another. And the prosecution of Milosevic, along with that of the head of the state of Rwanda, was one of the many instances in which there has been a mounting pressure on governance, not by citizens of that state as much as a register of an international global community. And therefore, one can also say that IR has seen the melting of boundaries. As much as boundaries have become important, there's also been a melting of boundaries whereby there's a recognition that we are all connected and accountable, and there is a solidarity of humanity which connects us across each other irrespective of our national identities. So we've looked at as to how war itself has become a questionable act. When chemical wars, weapons were used during the First World War, and there was a sense of horror about the possibilities of what could be done on the battlefield. From that time onwards, there is a recognized code of conduct even in warfare, and therefore you have the Geneva Code of Conduct. And whether it is war, in times of peace and in times of war, you have international organizations to regulate international conduct. It is not always successful. There have been international dictators who have escaped prosecution, who have not been hauled up, who have proceeded to carry out barbaric acts and not been questioned. Pol Pot, for instance, Pinochet of Chile, another. So there also have been instances, but there is at the same time a positive move towards prosecuting heads of states, and again that would have been impossible, inconceivable to think of maybe half a century ago. So the classic point is that IR is about regulation, codification, recognition of a global community. It has been aided by the flow of technology, by telecommunications, and we are seeing ourselves closer to one another as we had ever done before. The one area which compels us to see each other as fellow citizens across national boundaries are of course the two areas of trade and environment, and we'll be looking into both of them a little briefly, just to get a rough idea of the proportions of what we are talking about. So war is what we've just discussed, and now we will also look at two areas, that is trade and the environment. Now, I started off by this lecture by urging you all to think about what is available in your neighborhood grocery store, and to reflect upon whether these goods are manufactured in your country or whether they have been imported, the point of origin as a rule would say under the World Trade Organization. So just a little bit about another global organization, another international organization which shapes our lives in tiny, indiscernible, invisible ways, but it is nonetheless extremely palpable. If Woodrow Wilson was the force behind the League of Nations with a liberal spirit, it is during the Second World War that this liberalism is institutionalized via an organization. Now again, what do we very loosely, how do we define liberalism? Liberalism is a belief that is a theory, a political theory which argues that there must be a balance between the citizen and the state. The citizen has a private sphere in which the public sphere of the state cannot invade. Most crucially, however, that the state must encourage private entrepreneurship and private enterprise by not controlling the citizen. So the fundamental idea that we understand about liberalism is that the individual has a sense of agency, control over his own life, and as a corollary, the authority of the state is minimized. Classic example of that is the East India Company. Set up in 1600, it was the first global corporation. There's an excellent book by Tirthankar Roy on the matter. It's very slim and very readable. But essentially, the East India Company was profiteered from the liberal policies of the British government, which was to allow private companies to initiate entrepreneurship, to accumulate private profits. And the East India Company was one of the early examples of a private trading organization, which then also became a mercenary body. But the trajectory that I'm trying to draw over here is that right from the 16th century, there is a sense that this individual has a right to trade, to profit, to wage wars without the interference of the state. So the liberal idea is that the state interferes, and one has to minimize the authority of the state in the private sphere of the individual. Now getting back to the Second World War, this is institutionalized even while the Second World War is going on. So in 1944, we know that the Second World War took place between 1939 and 1945. In 1944, in a conference called the Bretton Woods Conference, a certain ideal is set up of institutionalizing this liberal ideal, by which I mean that institutions were imagined on trade which would collectively bring down tariffs, and tariffs are taxes on goods which cross the boundary, which cross the border, in order to promote free trade. Now, free trade is an interesting term. Free trade is not free, but free trade means freeing trade from the state, and where the opposite is where the state controls trade is a protectionist state. So, free trade, protectionism are two terms which are at the opposite bandwidth when we are looking at international flows of trade and goods. And in 1944, this idea is put forward of promoting trade in a degree by asking states to lower their tariff barriers so that it's easier to get goods across. And this is done by an organization called the GATT, which is the General Agreement on Trade and Tariff, which was opened for signature in 1947. Now, the GATT forms one organization which is along with two others, which is often called the unholy trinity. So, in 1944, the Bretton Woods organizations refer to three organizations: the World Bank, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the third is the GATT, to do with trade. The World Bank, the IMF, and GATT, which then became WTO in 1995, are those crucial bodies, those intrinsic bodies which upheld a new international liberal political economy. So, to repeat, just to simplify a few things, liberalism existed theoretically in practice at the individual state level from the 16th century. What changes in the mid 20th century is the fact that this is institutionalized, which I mean that it is an international organization which is given the mandate to carry this on, and that is certainly something unprecedented. And again, it points to the fact that international organizations have taken up a role far greater than what was originally envisaged and exercise control over our lives in far greater ways than what was originally conceptualized. Now, these three bodies seem extremely bureaucratic, and one would imagine that they have no control, or they are bureaucratic international structures. But these three bodies work collectively towards pressurizing governments to liberalize their political economy. The IMF lends money to states on the condition that they lower the tariff barriers. The World Bank helps developing countries with projects on the condition that they would lower their tariff barriers. And the World Trade Organization, formed in 1995, works towards lowering tariff barriers to promote the flow of goods and services. And the focus is on lowering tariff barriers is because tariff barriers is the only way whereby trade can flow freely between states. Of course, this has a long, complicated history and future. I'm not oversimplifying it, but just to give a general idea of what this unholy trinity symbolizes. Now, the interesting part is that while the IMF and the World Bank was set up after the Second World War, the GATT, which is the most contentious document, or contentious agreement rather, took another 50 years. So, from 1947 to 1995, it was a excruciatingly fought out battle between the developed states and the developing states for multiple valid reasons, because each one of them had to agree to have a consensus on the matter before things could proceed. And in 1995, the World Trade Organization was established. Its membership is over 190 countries, including China and Russia, which also means that organizations have reined states in an area and pull them collectively, even though they might oppose each other politically. So we've been looking at three areas. We looked at war as to how even in matters of war and crimes against humanity and genocide, heads of states are accountable by the Rome Statute and the International Crime Tribunal at The Hague. The second is everyday issues of trade. Who do we trade with? How do we trade? What is protectionism? What is the World Trade Organization? What are the issues between developing countries, developed countries? Issues of farmers dumping, there are multiple issues within that as well. And the third crucial area, which is an indicator of how the international is not something which is out there but pretty much in the room, it is the elephant in the room, is of course climate change. So we're looking at three areas: trade, violence, trade and environment, and now we're going to settle down and look at this area of environment. And the issue of climate change is a reminder that each one of us, our actions have a global repercussion, which is often calculated as your carbon footprint. But I'm just going to give a brief history of this and then try and see how this is imbricated in the international politics of rich states, poor states, developing countries and developed countries, starting with the 1960s. So 1962, very influential, now influential book was published by Rachel Carson called Silent Springs, and this book observed that birds were being influenced and were dying on account of the pesticide being used in crops. Now, Rachel Carson's book is a monumental work precisely because it was one of the early books, more than 50 years ago, which outlined as to how anthropocentric actions are changing the environment, by which I mean that decisions are impacting and changing the environment, specifically climate change, and changing the climate, making patterns of the climate unpredictable and in many ways wreaking havoc. Glaciers are melting, the sea levels are rising. So in many ways the human civilization itself is at risk in unpredictable ways for the first time. But the important thing as IR scholars is for us to understand as to how this even became an international issue. In 1988, the IPCC was set up, which was the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, and it is this organization which has been crucial in providing data on climate change. Now, for several states, rejecting the possibility of climate change has been a political issue. For instance, there have been people who have even rejected the notion that climate change is real. So very often its veracity is questioned. But in this classroom, one accepts that there is real, tangible evidence that there is a global change in weather patterns and migration and matters which should concern us deeply. Now, what is truly important is as to how climate change has become a global, state and individual level in committing oneself to reducing carbon footprints. The IPCC's reports for a long time went unheeded till the 1990s, till 1997, when the Kyoto Protocol was the first attempt where states were asked to commit to certain targets to pull down their carbon emissions. Again, within that there is a great deal of politics between rich states and poor states, where poor states going off on a carbon of a carbon fuel, carbon based economy might suffer developmental problems. So the crucial question is not just of the change in climate, it is also about multiple issues of our collective future. Our collective future as a civilization, a collective future on this planet. And climate change is one area where one sees the intersectionality of international organizations, developed countries who have profiteered from colonization between the 16th and the 20th century. And you also see the politics of developing countries who are being urged to shift to a green economy, to a renewable energy economy. And that pressure and that dynamism has shaped the politics of climate change itself, which we will be looking at in a subsequent class. So just to wrap things up for today's lecture, we started out by looking at what is the international. We have looked at multiple ways of looking at the international. We have looked at who are the players in international relations. We've looked at the state, we've looked at international law, we've looked at foreign policy. We've also looked at non-state actors, be it religion, be it international organizations, be it terrorist groups, which fundamentally push us to view the world in an interconnected way, which is also, on a final note, extremely frightening. The fact that our lives can be manipulated and influenced by organizations, players sitting millions and millions of miles away from us is a frightening realization, but it also pushes us to the truth that eventually we are a global community of humanity, of humankind, and we must see each other for that. So in the next class, we will be looking at the first theory of IR, and that is realism. And in the subsequent lectures, of course, you'll be looking at each of these tiny areas, which each of them are worthy of several hours of discussion. But in the next class, we will be looking at realism. Thank you.